So when we think about that minimum conception of morality that Rachel's talked about in the early readings, part of that minimum conception is equal consideration of interests, impartiality to some degree in determining what's right and what's wrong, what's ethically required and what's ethically not required. But these criticisms suggest that that mechanism, which seemed, at least on the surface, like a good thing, in fact, is an inept mechanism from an ethical perspective for guaranteeing equal consideration or for promoting impartiality. And there are two sorts of illustrations that Rachel presents for us of this kind of criticism. So on the one hand, he notes that theorists argue that utilitarianism looks like it demands too much of individuals. It seems to require actions on their part that are ethically supererogatory, that go above and beyond what could be reasonably expected of agents from an ethical theory. So how does this objection go? Well, imagine that you're sitting at home watching TV, relaxing, and you think to yourself, if I just took an extra shift at work, I'd lose a little of the happiness that I get from walking in the park and playing with my dog, so on. But if I took that money that I make with that extra shift and I donate it to charities that help people in the developing world, I would dramatically increase the happiness of people in the developing world, while really only taking a small hit to my own personal happiness. So I probably ought to do that. And I think people make these kinds of calculations when they give to charity. At least thoughtful people do. They think to themselves, look, I can take some of my income that's not necessary, my discretionary income, and I can do something that will help other people, and that's a good thing. But according to utilitarianism, it seems like it's not a good thing, it's a requirement. And in fact, once I start doing those calculations, it seems to sort of lead me towards, making my own happiness and needs subservient to the happiness and needs of others. So I think after I start working that extra shift, well, you know what? I'm creating increased happiness. And sure, my happiness has gone down maybe a little bit, but the net happiness has increased. And in fact, if I were to work an extra shift, I would double that happiness. And sure, my happiness would take a pretty significant hit, but the net happiness would still be much higher by my doing that. So it looks like I need to do that. And in fact, now that I think about it, every moment that I spend attending to my own needs, that's not a moment that's necessary for me to continue fulfilling my obligations, is a moment that I've wasted from my utilitarian perspective. Every waking moment I have, I should be trying to earn money. And every dollar and penny that I earn that isn't necessary to sustain myself at this minimum level, to continue functioning, every penny that I spend that isn't devoted to that should be donated to charity, because by doing that, sure, my happiness is going to go down dramatically. Right? I'm going to subjugate my own personal fulfillment and happiness to the needs of others. But the net happiness that results from my doing this will be dramatic, so that I will maximize the greatest good for the greatest number by devoting all of my time and fiscal resources that aren't necessary for my own basic survival and sustenance to the welfare of others, to these charities in developing countries. Now, there are certainly examples of individuals who engage in this kind of selfless behavior, right? Or they subjugate their own life to helping others, and they're ethically praiseworthy. But this criticism suggests that utilitarianism doesn't want us to praise these people as being people who go above and beyond. It seems to require that we all behave this way. And in this way, it requires too much of individual agents. Now consider the other line of argumentation that Rachels presents. Some theorists argue that utilitarianism, by having this mechanism that says everyone's happiness should be treated equally and impartially, just summed in our calculations. By doing that, it forbids us having any partiality. In the first example, it was partiality for our own happiness and fulfillment. But we're also seemingly ethically allowed to have a certain amount of partiality towards the happiness of our friends, family, our own society or culture over strangers and other societies and other cultures. And so it seems to require us to unethically ignore the kinds of connections and affections that form the natural basis of bonds between friends and families, knit together societies. And so in this way, right, it seems to force us into an impartiality that blinds us to our own natural connections to other people, forbids any expression of that whatsoever. So how would that kind of argument go? Well, imagine that your parents are deciding whether or not to pay that tuition bill for you, and they think to themselves, wow, if I pay this tuition bill, I get my child through college. That will dramatically increase their happiness as an individual. So, for instance, college education has been calculated to roughly double the earned income during a working lifetime. So, just on sheer fiscal measures alone, I will dramatically increase the happiness of my child by paying their college tuition. But I can't really allow myself to be partial to my own child's happiness. Suppose I take that tuition money and I donate it to those charities that help impoverished people around the world. Impoverished people will have a dramatic increase in their happiness by just a tiny amount of money. And so that tuition money is going to go a really long way. It's going to create a lot of happiness out there in the world, much more happiness than will be created for my child by paying their college tuition. So it seems like I'm really ethically required to not pay for my college tuition and instead donate that money to charities that help the impoverished around the world. So again, this seems ethically dubious. It seems like we're allowed to show some partiality to our own happiness, the happiness of our friends, our family, our community, over and above the happiness of strangers who we'll never meet or never interact with. And so these lines of argumentation suggest that this mechanism of equal consideration, of impartiality in determining the ethical status of actions that's built into utilitarianism really is inapt. It requires agents both to care too little about their own happiness and the happiness of people close to them, and too much about the happiness of strangers. It seems to, just by sheer numbers, force people to consider the welfare of others over the welfare of themselves and the people close to them. And so it seems an inapt mechanism for getting that equal consideration of the interests of all people involved. So now we've looked at the various criticisms that have been offered up against utilitarianism. Let's look at the possible responses utilitarians could make. The modification that some utilitarians have offered up that they hope will address these criticisms.